On a crisp autumn morning, Alana and Amara Mitchell stood trembling in the heart of a bustling courtroom in Hawthorne City, Mississippi, their pulses hammering in their ears like frantic drumbeats. The air was thick with tension, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel heavier than the last. Across the aisle, two police officers Darren Walters and Brent Kilroy lounged with an infuriating ease, their lips curled into smug, self-assured smirks. These were the men who had dragged the twin sisters into this nightmare, arresting them under flimsy pretenses just months earlier. Their arrogance seemed unshakable, as if they held all the cards in a game the sisters didn't even know they were playing. But what those officers couldn't possibly suspect was that far beyond the chipped wooden benches and flickering fluorescent lights of this small-town courthouse, a storm was brewing gone orchestrated by the U.S. Department of Justice and Attorney General Merrick Garland himself. A secret so dark and damning lurked in the officers' past that, once uncovered, it would flip the script entirely, leaving their smugness to rot in the dust. Alana and Amara weren't just sisters, they were two halves of the same soul, bound by a connection only twins could understand. Growing up in a modest clapboard house on the edge of Hawthorne City, they'd been inseparable since childhood, their laughter echoing through the narrow streets as they chased each other under the sprawling oaks. Alana, with her sharp wit and fiery spirit, often took the lead, while Amara, softer spoken but fiercely perceptive, balanced her with a quiet strength. They finished each other's sentences, shared secret glances that spoke volumes, and carved out paths together through a world that didn't always welcome them with open arms. Their parents, Clarice and Leonard Mitchell, had raised them with love, and Clarice pouring her heart into her work as a social worker, Leonard filling their evenings with tales of history and resilience from his years teaching. At the local high school, the family's roots ran deep in this community, a place where pride in their heritage fueled their determination to rise above hardship and give back to those around them. The sisters shone like beacons in their little corner of Mississippi. Both in their early 20s, they'd earned reputations as brilliant students and tireless volunteers, spending countless hours tutoring kids at the local youth center or organizing food drives for struggling families. Their optimism was infectious, their smiles alight in the often shadowed streets of Hawthorne City. But on a sticky July evening, that light flickered. They'd spent the day at the youth program, surrounded by the chatter of children practicing multiplication tables and stumbling over tricky words in their reading books. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the twins bickered playfully about who'd foot the bill for ice cream, our rare treat, after a long day. Amara insisted it was Alana's turn, her teasing grin wide, while Alana countered with mock indignation, hands on her hips. They settled on a little shop near the city park, a familiar spot usually alive with the squeals of kids on swings and the hum of neighbors catching up. Tonight, though, an eerie stillness hung over the place, the air buzzing with an unease neither could name. As they strolled toward their beat-up sedan, a police cruiser crept along behind them, its engine a low growl cutting through the quiet. At first, they barely noticed cops patrolled these streets often enough, and most were civil, if aloof. But something about the way this car shadowed them, its headlights glinting off the pavement like predators' eyes, set their nerves jangling. Alana shot Amara a sideways glance, her brow furrowing. The cruiser circled once, then twice, before easing up beside them. Officer Darren Walters stepped out, his boots hitting the asphalt with a deliberate thud. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his pale face unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. His hand rested lightly on his holster, not a threat, not yet, but a quiet reminder of the power he wielded. Behind him, Officer Brent Kilroy stayed in the driver's seat, his sharp eyes scanning the darkening park as if expecting trouble to leap out from the shadows. "Good evening, officer," Amara said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt creeping up her spine. Alana stood close, her posture stiff, bristling at Walter's casual confidence. "Can we help you?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with wariness. Walters didn't respond right away. He circled them slowly, his gaze sliding over Alana's worn sneakers and up to Amara's neatly braided hair, searching for something he could pin on them. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable, until he finally spoke. Mind showing me some ID? His voice was flat, the request abrupt. Amara's stomach twisted. There was no reason for this, no traffic stop, no incident, but she dug into her back pocket for her license anyway. Alana fumbled with her purse, her fingers shaking as she handed hers over, her mind racing to figure out what they'd done to draw the scrutiny. Walters took the IDs, studying them with exaggerated care. Then, out of nowhere, there's a report of suspicious activity near the park. You'd have fit the description. His words were vague, slippery, the kind of excuse that could mean anything or nothing. Amara's heart thudded harder. She'd heard too many stories, friends pulled over for fitting a description, cousins hassled for no reason but the color of their skin. What kind of suspicious activity? She pressed, forcing calm into her voice. Walter's lips twitched into a smirk. We asked the questions, not you. At that, Kilroy emerged from the cruiser, swaggering over with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Any weapons on you ladies? Anything we should know about? His tone dripped with mockery. The implication clear. Alana's jaw tightened, her fists clenching at her sides. No, of course not, she snapped, barely holding her temper. Then Walters gestured to their car. We'd like to search your vehicle. It wasn't a question. The sisters exchanged a look. They knew their rights, knew they could say no without probable cause, but the weight of the moment pressed down on them. Two white officers, oozing authority, staring them down on a quiet stretch of road. Refusing could turn this into something uglier, something dangerous. Alana swallowed hard, her throat dry. Go ahead, she muttered, glancing at Amara, who gave a small, defeated nod. The officers didn't hesitate. They tore into the sedan, yanking open doors, rifling through the trunk, tossing aside jackets and crumpled volunteer flyers like they were trash. Minutes ticked by, the sisters standing frozen, dread pooling in their guts. Then Walters straightened up, a triumphant gleam in his eye, holding a small plastic bag neither had ever seen. Inside, a powdery substance glinted under the streetlights. Well, look what we have here, he crowed. Possession of a controlled substance, ladies. Time seemed to shatter. Amara's voice broke as she whispered, that's not ours. We've never seen it before. But her plea bounced off the officers like rain on pavement. Kilroy barked a laugh, cuffing their wrists with a flourish as he recited their rights, his voice laced with theatrical glee. The walk to the cruiser was a blur of humiliation. Eagers peeked from behind curtains, some with pity, others with the same smug curiosity the cops wore. For Alana and Amara, the world tilted. They'd built their lives on doing right, studying hard, helping others, staying out of trouble, and now, in an instant, they were shackled, branded criminals. Their fear clawed at them, a wild, suffocating thing, but beneath it, a spark of defiance flickered. This wasn't the end, not yet. Locked in a holding cell at the Hawthorne City Police Station, the sisters sat under a harsh fluorescent glow, the beige walls closing in around them. The air was stale, tinged with the faint scent of sweat and despair. Stripped of their phones, their purses, their freedom, they clung to each other with their eyes, silently promising they'd get through this. Hours dragged by until Sergeant Miriam Foley appeared, a stern, middle-aged woman with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her face was all hard lines, like a school principal ready to dole out punishment. But her eyes held a flicker of something softer, empathy, maybe, or just fatigue. She fired off questions, addresses, emergency contacts, medical conditions, her pen scratching across the paper without looking up. Any allergies? She asked, her tone clipped. Amara shook her head, her throat tight. No, none. Foley scribbled something, then added, your bail hearing will be scheduled soon. But with charges this serious, it might not be tonight. Alana's frustration boiled over. Serious? We don't even know what we're charged with exactly. Those drugs aren't ours. Foley paused, her gaze lifting briefly, a sigh escaping her lips. She didn't argue, didn't reassure, just turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Amara sank onto the bench, hugging herself as a shudder ran through her. They planted that bag. Alana. I know it. Alana dropped beside her, their shoulders brushing. We've got to call Mom and Dad. We need a lawyer, Simeon, who'll fight this, outside, beyond the cold walls of that cell. Forces were stirring, threads of justice weaving together in ways neither sister could imagine. The officer's laughter might echo now, but the truth was clawing its way to the surfacing when it broke free. It would demand a reckoning. A wave of nausea twisted through Alana's gut, her nerves fraying as the reality of their situation sank in deeper with every passing second. She couldn't shake the gnawing fear that in a place like this, a sleepy, tight-knit town where whispers carried more weight than evidence, the so-called justice system could twist itself into something grotesque, something far removed from fairness. She and her sister Amara had heard the chilling tales before. Young black men and women swept up in a current of fabricated charges, their voices drowned out by coerced confessions or outright lies. Those stories had always felt distant, like echoes from some other world. But now, trapped in this dimly lit holding cell with its cracked concrete walls and the faint stench of mildew hanging in the air, that nightmare was no longer hypothetical, it was theirs. Time crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity of dread. Alana's mind raced, replaying the night's events over and over, searching for some crack in the absurdity of it all. They'd been volunteering at the youth center just hours ago, sorting donations and laughing with the kid show had it spiraled into this. Her stomach churned again, a mix of anger and helplessness bubbling up as she glanced at Amara, who sat silently beside her, staring at the floor. Amara's usual spark was dimmed, her shoulders slumped under the weight of their shared uncertainty. Finally, the heavy clank of boots echoed down the hall, and a stern-faced officer appeared, his expression unreadable as he motioned for them to follow. One by one, they were led away to separate interrogation rooms, the isolation amplifying Alana's unease. When her turn came, Alana stepped into a cramped, windowless space that felt more like a cage than a room. The walls were a dull, lifeless gray, scuffed and peeling in places, and a single bulb dangled overhead, casting harsh shadows across the sparse furniture, a scratched metal table, and two rickety chairs. Across from her sat Officer Walters, his presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, a smug twist to his lips that made Alana's skin crawl. He gestured lazily for her to sit, his eyes glinting with something cold and predatory as he sized her up. "So, Alana," he began, his voice dripping with mock curiosity, "why don't you tell me about that little stash we found in your trunk?" His tone was casual, almost playful, but it carried an edge that set her nerves on fire. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her voice steady despite the tremor threatening to break through. "I already told you it's not mine. We were volunteering tonight. We don't have anything to do with drugs." Her words felt fragile, like they might shatter against the wall of his indifference. Walters waved a hand, brushing her explanation aside as if it were a pesky fly. Right. You and your sister are just perfect little angels, aren't you? Good girls who'd never dream of stepping out of line. That's what they all say." He leaned forward slightly, his smirk widening. "But here's the thing, you've got a job to do. We got a tip earlier tonight, anonymous, about two women hanging around the park, looking suspicious, maybe dealing. And then, lo and behold, we find drugs in your car. You really expect me to just let that slide?" Heat surged to Alana's cheeks, a flush of indignation and fear. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening as she leaned toward him, her voice shaking but resolute. "I don't care what tip you got, it's a lie. We've never dealt drugs. We've never even touched them. This is insane." He clicked his tongue, a theatrical sound of disappointment that grated on her ears. "Save the sob story for the judge, sweetheart." Then his expression shifted, his eyes narrowing with a glint that made her stomach drop. "Unless you're willing to cooperate." Her brow furrowed, suspicion tightening her chest. "Cooperate?" she echoed, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. He shrugged, feigning nonchalance, though his gaze never wavered. "Tell me who's really behind it. Give me a name, someone higher up the chain. And maybe, just maybe, I could put in a good word with the DA. A deal to take the heat off you and your sister." His voice was smooth, calculated, a salesman pitching a rotten deal. Alana's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She saw through his game, and Stanley was fishing, trying to trap her into weaving a lie, pinning this on some imaginary scapegoat to save herself. But there was no one to name, no bigger fish to fry. This was a setup, pure and simple. A twisted ploy to boost arrest numbers or settle some petty score she couldn't even fathom. The injustice of it burned in her chest, a fire stoked by every smug word he uttered. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling with defiance. "There's nothing to tell because none of this is real." Walter's face hardened, the mask of fake friendliness slipping away to reveal something colder, more menacing. "Fine," he snapped, standing abruptly and snatching a thin file from the table. "Have it your way. We'll see how you and your sister enjoy jail when these charges stick." He strode to the door, pausing just long enough to shoot her a final, venomous look before stepping out, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. Her stomach twisted into knots as she sat there, the room closing in around her. Minutes later, another officer escorted her back to the holding cell, where Amara soon joined her. Her sister's eyes were rimmed with red, glistening with unshed tears, and Alana felt a pang of guilt and protectiveness surge through her. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The weight of what they'd endured in those separate rooms hung between them, a silent understanding that whatever Walters had said to Amara, it had been just as vile, just as manipulative. Hours dragged on, the night stretching into an endless void of despair, until a faint glimmer of hope broke through just before dawn. The cell door creaked open, and there stood their parents, Leonard and Clarice Mitchell, their faces etched with exhaustion and worry. Beside them was Nina Barnes, a local attorney whose petite frame belied the fierce energy radiating from her. With her close-cropped hair and sharp, determined eyes, Nina stormed into the station like a force of nature, her voice cutting through the stale air as she demanded an immediate hearing for Alana and Amara's release on bail. There was resistance. Of course, he grumbled back and forth with the officers on duty, but Nina's tenacity won out. The sisters were told they'd face a judge that afternoon. Alana sank into a corner of the cell, her body heavy with exhaustion, her eyelids drooping as she fought the urge to collapse. She wanted nothing more than to wake up from this nightmare, to find herself back in her bed with the world making sense again. Amara slid closer, her hand finding Alana's, their fingers lacing together in a grip that felt like an anchor. It was the same way they'd held onto each other as kids, huddled under blankets during thunderstorms, trusting that the rumble would pass. But this storm was different, darker, more relentless, and they both knew it. When the afternoon sun climbed high, its heat pressing down on the cracked pavement outside, Alana and Amara were shuffled into a police van, their wrists bound by cold metal cuffs that chafed against their skin. The ride to the Hawthorne City Courthouse was short but suffocating, the air inside the van thick with tension. As they stepped out, the crowd milling around the courthouse steps erupted into murmurs. Some recognized the twins from their volunteer work or their college accolades, their whispers a mix of shock and curiosity. Alana lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet their gazes, though each step up those worn stone stairs felt like wading through molasses. Inside, the courthouse was a relic of another era: high ceilings with peeling paint, wooden benches groaning under the weight of spectators, and ancient ceiling fans that spun lazily. Doing little to stir the muggy air, Nina led them to a small side room where their parents waited. Leonard's hands trembled as he gripped his daughter's shoulders, his deep voice cracking as he promised they'd get through this. Clarice dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, her soft words urging them to hold on to hope. Nina, ever the pragmatist, launched into a brisk rundown of the bail process, her tone steady but firm as she warned them to stay composed no matter what unfolded. The courtroom itself was a theater of tension, packed with reporters, townsfolk, and the faint hum of anticipation. Judge Albert Cohen, a stout man with a stern brow and a perpetual frown, presided from his perch, his gavel resting lightly in his hand. Across the room, officers Walters and Kilroy lounged against the wall, their casual postures and whispered exchanges dripping with arrogance. Alana caught Walters' eye for a split second, and the smirk he flashed her sent a shiver of rage down her spine. When the sisters were called to the stand, the room fell silent, every breath held in suspense. Nina stepped forward, her voice clear and commanding as she argued for bail. She painted a vivid picture of Alana and Amara's livest dedicated students, community pillars. No criminal history, no reason to flee. But then the assistant district attorney rose, a stack of papers in hand. his words sharp and accusing. "What we have here," he declared, "is a clear case of suspected drug trafficking. The evidence is damning a significant quantity of a controlled substance found in their possession. The law must act decisively to protect this community." From the back, Walters let out a low, mocking chuckle, just loud enough to pierce the silence. Kilroy joined in with a snort, their disrespected deliberate jab that sliced through the air. Alana's face burned, humiliation warring with fury as she clenched her fists under the table. She glanced at Amara, whose jaw was tight, her eyes blazing with the same barely contained anger. They were laughing at their pain, at the farce of justice unfolding before them. It took every ounce of restraint to heed Nina's advice, to swallow the scream clawing at her throat. Judge Cohen adjusted his glasses, peering down at Nina. "Does the defense have a response to these allegations of a broader trafficking operation?" Nina straightened, her hands clasped confidently. "Yes, Your Honor. My clients categorically deny any involvement with drugs. We have documented proof of their whereabouts volunteer hours at the youth center, time-stamped and corroborated. We ask that they be released on their own reconnaissance, or at the very least, that bail be set at a reasonable amount." The judge hesitated, his gavel tapping lightly against the desk as he mulled it over. "Bail is granted," he finally said, his voice gruff. "But given the gravity of the charges, I'll set it high." He scribbled a number steep, but within reach for the Mitchells after some effort. A ripple of relief passed through Alana, Amara, and their parents, though it was tempered by the lingering sting of Walters and Kilroy's sneers as they filed out, their muttered jabs about privileged girls cutting deep. Outside, the ordeal wasn't over. The courthouse steps swarmed with reporters, cameras flashing like lightning, microphones jabbing at them from every angle. Questions rained down about the drugs, the charges, their families' response, each one laced with insinuation. Nina took charge, her voice slicing through the chaos as she delivered a terse statement. "My clients are innocent. We urge the public to reserve judgment as we investigate." A bold reporter shoved a mic toward Alana, asking if she thought the police had planted evidence. She parted her lips to speak, but Nina cut in smoothly. "We're looking into all possibilities." No further comment. As they pushed through the throng toward a waiting car, Alana's mind churned. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a lesson raw and brutal, about how power could bend justice into a weapon. Walters and Kilroy weren't anomalies. They were symptoms of a system that thrived on control. Not truth, but in the clasp of Amara's hand, in Nina's unwavering resolve, and in the distant hope that someone, somewhere, might see through the lies. Alana found a flicker of strength. The consequences of unchecked authority were steep, but so too was the will to fight back. The engine of the old sedan sputtered as it pulled away from the courthouse, a faint hum carrying Alana, Amara, and their parents through the dusty streets of Hawthorne City. A family friend had offered the ride, his hands steady on the wheel despite the tension radiating from his passengers. The late afternoon sun glared through the windshield, casting long shadows over their weary faces. By the time they reached the Donera-weathered little joint with chipped paint and a flickering neon sign, they were drained, their bodies sinking into the worn vinyl booth like stones dropped into still water. Alana's hands trembled as she wrapped them around a steaming mug of chamomile tea, the warmth seeping into her palms, but doing little to thaw the icy dread coiling in her chest. Amara sat across from her, clutching her own cup, her dark eyes glassy with disbelief. "This doesn't feel real," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the day. "Just hours ago, we were volunteering along with those kids at the youth center. That's got to count for something, right? Proof we're not who they say we are." Now Barnes, their fiercely loyal friend, slid into the booth beside them, her jaw tight with resolve. She leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "I'm digging up everything I can, security footage from the center, statements from the kids you tutored, staff sign-in sheets, every scrap of evidence I can get my hands on. They won't bury you under these lies, not if I have anything to say about it." Her words were a lifeline, a thread of hope in the suffocating fog of fear that enveloped them. Clarice and Leonard, the twins' parents, sat at the ends of the booth, their faces etched with lines deepened by worry and exhaustion. Clarice tried to muster a smile, her lips trembling as she reached for Leonard's hand under the table. Her fingers gripped his tightly, as if anchoring herself against the storm threatening to sweep their family away. Leonard's broad shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of their dwindling savings pressing down on him. Bail had already stretched their finances to the breaking point, a jagged tier in an already threadbare safety net, and that was just the beginning. The legal fees loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon, promising to drain what little they had left. But worse than the money was the gnawing injustice of it all: false charges, the smirking cops, the whispers that followed them like shadows. Above their heads, the diner's ancient television buzzed with the midday news, a dull drone that Alana couldn't bring herself to hear. Her thoughts churned relentlessly, replaying the moment in the courtroom when Officers Walters and Kilroy had laughed Lopez. The gavel fell. The sound echoed in her skull, a mocking chorus that drowned out everything else. Amara's gaze drifted to the window, where the world outside moved on without them. A police cruiser rolled by, its tires crunching against the gravel, and for a fleeting second, she swore she saw Kilroy's angular face in the passenger seat, his cold eyes boring into her. Her breath hitched, and she gripped her tea tighter. "They're watching us," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I can feel it." Na flicked her eyes toward the window, her expression hardening. "Let them watch. We've got nothing to hide." They, on the other hand, she trailed off, her lips pressing into a thin line as she weighed her next words. "I've been hearing things, rumors through back channels. The Department of Justice might be sniffing around Mississippi police departments. Corruption, racial profiling, the works. No hard proof yet, but if it's true, Walters and Kilroy could be in someone's crosshairs." Leonard straightened, his brows shooting up as a flicker of curiosity broke through his fatigue. "You mean Hawthorne City PD specifically?" he asked, his deep voice tinged with cautious hope. Na shrugged, her tone measured. "Can't say for sure, but if the DOJ digs deep enough, those two might not be laughing for long." Her words sparked something fragile in the group, a tiny ember of possibility glowing amidst the ashes of their despair. If the feds were truly investigating, maybe this nightmare could turn into something bigger. Maybe justice wasn't just a hollow word. Amara's eyes met Alana's across the table, a silent understanding passing between them. The sting of the courtroom humiliation still burned the officers' sneers, the judge's indifference, but now a faint glimmer of retribution flickered on the horizon. For now, though, reality was a cold, unyielding wall, an arraignment looming, felony charges dangling over their heads like a guillotine, and a community buzzing with rumors that twisted the truth into something unrecognizable. As they left the diner, the late afternoon sun bathed them in golden light, and they linked hands, their steps slow but resolute. No amount of mockery or intimidation would silence them. Somewhere beyond the corrupt gears of local law enforcement, the machinery of justice was creaking to life, and the sisters clung to the hope that it would soon shake the system to its core. Over the next few weeks, the Mitchell household transformed into a battlefield. The dining room table, once a place for family meals and laughter, became a chaotic sprawl of legal files, scribbled notes, and pinned-up foam logs. Alana and Amara sat hunched over it for hours, their eyes bleary as they recounted every moment of the day that had shattered their lives. Na was there too, her sleeves rolled up, her sharp mind cutting through the haze as she jotted down details: the kids they'd tutored, the songs playing on the youth center radio, even the strawberry ice cream they'd planned to grab after their shift. It was grueling, peeling back every second of that day like skin from a wound, but they knew it mattered. Every fragment could be the key to dismantling the lie Walters and Kilroy had built. Outside their walls, an invisible menace lingered. The community split like a cracked mirror. Some neighbors rallied behind the sisters, bringing casseroles and words of encouragement, while others pulled away, their faces shadowed by suspicion or fear of crossing the police. One humid afternoon, an elderly woman from down the street shuffled up to Clarice on the porch, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Bad people been asking about you," she said, her gnarled hands clutching a shawl, flashing badges. But they didn't feel right. Not like real law. Clarice's stomach twisted, but she nodded, thanking the woman with a strained smile. Days later, Leonard found a note taped to his car windshield, a jagged scrawl in black ink. "Stop pushing. You don't know who you're messing with." He stood there in the driveway, the paper crumpling in his fist, his heart pounding with a mix of fury and dread. He didn't tell Clarice right away, not wanting to add to her sleepless nights, but the threat hung over him like a storm cloud. Despite the creeping fear, Alana and Amara fought to hold onto normalcy. They laced up their sneakers at dawn, jogging through the quiet streets as the first light painted the sky pink, their breaths sensing in a rhythm that steadied their frayed nerves. At night, they crowded into the kitchen with their parents, chopping vegetables and stirring pots, the clatter of dishes a small rebellion against the chaos. When the youth center cleared them to volunteer again, they jumped at the chance, refusing to let the world or themselves believe they were broken. One evening, as the twins hunched over laptops in their shared bedroom, tackling assignments for their community college courses, the family phone pierced the silence. Clarice's voice floated up from the kitchen, sharp with surprise, then softened into a trembling gasp. Alana and Amara bolted downstairs, their socked feet skidding on the hardwood. Clarice stood by the counter, the receiver still in her hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "That was the Department of Justice," she said, her voice quivering with cautious joy. "They know about your case. They want to meet you." Wouldn't say much over the phone, but they hinted at a bigger investigation. Leonard stepped closer, resting a steady hand on her shoulder, his own eyes wide with a mix of relief and disbelief. The next day, 2 officials arrived at the Mitchell home. Special Agent Carla Ruiz from the FBI strode in first, her dark suit crisp against the faded wallpaper, her gaze sweeping the room with quiet authority. Beside her was Daniel Berger, an assistant U.S. attorney from the Civil Rights Division, his tie slightly askew as if he'd loosened it after a long day. They flashed their badges, real ones, not the flimsy facsimiles the neighbors had warned about, and settled into the living room. Ruiz's eyes locked onto the twins, her expression softening with a rare flicker of empathy. "I'm so sorry for what you've endured," she said, her voice firm yet kind. "If you're up for it, we'd like to hear your story." The sisters nodded, their throats tight as they recounted the arrest, flashing lights, the rough hands, the smirks of Walters and Kilroy as they found drugs that didn't belong to them. Berger typed furiously on his laptop, while Ruiz leaned in, her questions sharp and precise, pulling out details the twins hadn't even realized they remembered. When they finished, Berger looked up, his tone gentle but serious. "We can't promise quick answers, but we're seeing a pattern in Mississippian explain busts, clean records suddenly tarnished, evidence that doesn't add up. Your testimony could be a cornerstone for a federal case." Alana's heart thudded, a fragile hope battling the exhaustion in her bones. "So they might actually pay for this?" she asked, her voice small, as if afraid to believe it. Ruiz exchanged a look with Berger, then nodded. "If we prove systemic civil rights violations, those responsible could face federal charges, but it won't be easy. Corruption's roots run deep, and these officers won't go quietly." Her words were a warning wrapped in promise, and the Mitchells met each other's eyes, their resolve hardening like steel. "Nah," who joined them for the meeting, crossed her arms, her voice cutting through the tension. "They've pushed us too far to back down now. We're not afraid." The agents left with assurances of updates, and for the first time, Alana and Amara felt a crack in the wall of despair, a sliver of light piercing the darkness. The days that followed buzzed with activity, more calls from the DOJ, more visits, an official summons for a grand jury if it came to that. But the shadows grew too. One night, Alana stood at her bedroom window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched a dark car idling at the street's end, its headlights off, its engine a low growl. It lingered for nearly an hour before vanishing into the night. Another time, Amara's phone rang with anonymous calculants on the other end. Then a click. Na brushed it off as intimidation, but the unease lingered. Whispers about Walters and Kilroy began to swirl, rumors of a tight-knit clique of cops who padded their stats with planted drugs, targeting young black men and women like pawns in a twisted game. The lesson was clear: power, unchecked, bred corruption, and justice, though slow, was a force that could topple even the mightiest abusers. For Alana and Amara, the fight was more than personal, it was a reckoning, a chance to expose a system that thrived on silence and fear. And as the wheels of justice turned, they vowed to see it through, no matter the cost. In the stillness of a Mississippi night, the air hung heavy with secrets in the modest bedroom shared by Amara and Alana Mitchell. The twin sisters sat cross-legged on the worn quilt, their hushed voices weaving a tapestry of determination amidst the shadows. Cast by a flickering bedside lamp, fear gnawed at them, a relentless specter pacing the edges of their resolve. But it was overshadowed by a fierce, unyielding fire in their hearts. Amara's dark eyes gleamed with conviction as she leaned closer to her sister, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We have to speak out," she said, her tone resolute, "not just for ourselves, but for every soul those monsters have crushed under their boots." Alana, her face a mirror of her sister's intensity, squeezed Amara's hand tightly, her grip a silent vow. The memory of sneering laughter from a courtroom where their innocence had been mocked by two corrupt officers, Walters and Kilroy, burned in their minds like a brand. That sound, cruel and hollow, didn't just taunt them, it steeled their nerves, fueling a fight not only for their own freedom, but to tear down a rotten system that thrived on abusing power. Justice, they knew, was a double-edged sword, and its pursuit would expose the consequences of unchecked authority in ways that could ripple far beyond their small town. The sisters couldn't yet fathom how the arrogance of those two racist copsmen, shielded by a web of higher-ups who turned a blind eye, would soon curdle into desperate pleas as the Department of Justice began peeling back the festering layers of their deceit. Walters and Kilroy weren't just reckless, they were architects of a sinister game, planting evidence like seeds in a poisoned field to harvest promotions and hollow accolades. If the whispers swirling through Hawthorne City were true, their closet held more than one skeleton. It concealed a darkness so profound it could topple not just their badges, but the very foundation of the police department that had cradled their corruption. By mid-August, the first crack appeared in their carefully built facade. The local news flickered to life in the Mitchells' cramped living room, where Alana and Amara sat on a sagging couch, their eyes glued to the grainy broadcast. Reports buzzed about the suspension of two unnamed officers from the Hawthorne City Police Department, pending an internal affairs probe. The anchor's voice was clipped, professional, but the sisters felt the weight behind the words. The rumor mill churned faster than a summer storm, and within hours, the names Walters and Kilroy surfaced like debris in floodwaters. Outside the police station, a press conference unfolded under a blistering sun. Colonel Harold March, the police chief, stood stiff as a board, his gray suit wrinkled from the heat, his jaw clenched as he read from a crumpled sheet of paper, his voice a monotone mask of authority. "We've received allegations of misconduct against two of our officers," he declared, his eyes darting away from the cameras. "While we won't tolerate wrongdoing, we urge the public to reserve judgment until the investigation concludes." He offered no answers to the shouted questions, retreating into the building as reporters swarmed like hornets, their speculation crackling through the airwaves. This tied to a rumored federal inquiry. In the Mitchell home, Nina Barnes paced the linoleum floor, her phone pressed to her ear as she sifted through a flood of calls and texts from her legal contacts. A civil rights lawyer with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, Nina had become the sisters' fiercest ally. Her braids swayed as she shook her head, excitement warring with caution in her voice. "They're saying Walters and Kilroy planted evidence in at least 3 arrests," she murmured, her fingers tapping the counter. "If that holds, we're looking at a pattern, a blueprint of corruption." Each update she relayed painted a grimmer portrait of the officers' crimes, and with every word, the stakes grew higher. A few days later, the Department of Justice dropped a bombshell, a sweeping civil rights investigation into the Hawthorne City PD. The announcement, signed by Attorney General Merrick Garland himself, cited a litany of credible complaints: racial bias, evidence tampering, constitutional violations. It was a thunderclap in their small Mississippi town, a signal that the federal eye had turned toward them, unblinking and relentless. Meanwhile, Walters and Kilroy shrank into the shadows, officially sidelined to desk duty. They were soon persona non grata at the station, their presence a liability the department couldn't afford. Local radio hosts chewed over the gossipsome, said the pair had hired a slick Jackson law firm. Others swore they'd bolt if the heat grew too intense. But the tension didn't stay confined to the airwaves. Strange cars began circling the Mitchell street at odd hours, their headlights slicing through the humid night. One evening, Alana peered through the blinds, her breath catching as she glimpsed a silhouette that could have been Walter's stocky frame in a passing sedan. Another night, Clarissa Twin's sharp-witted aunt who'd moved in to help froze by the kitchen window, swearing she heard boots crunching in the backyard. Her husband, Leonard, a burly man with a quiet strength, grabbed a flashlight and scoured the property, finding nothing but damp grass and unease. Nina, ever practical, insisted on security cameras, her voice tight with worry. "We're stirring a hornet's nest," she warned, "and they don't like it one bit." As the official scrutiny tightened, whispers from the community grew louder, each story a shard of glass in the officer's crumbling facade. Darnell Thompson, a weary mechanic from the auto shop down the road, approached Nina one muggy afternoon, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His voice trembled as he recounted how Walters had strong-armed him into rigging cars, with hidden compartments for staged drug busts, threatening his livelihood if he refused. Across county lines, a soft-spoken teacher named Marla Evans shared her own nightmare, a traffic stop, where Kilroy loomed over her, his badge glinting in the dusk. Demanding she name a drug dealer or face arrest, she'd stood her ground, trembling but defiant, only to be detained briefly and released with no explanation. Fear had silenced her until now, but the dam was breaking. Each tale hinted at something uglier than isolated Abusessa scheme, perhaps to siphon money, seize property, or extort the vulnerable, all under the guise of law and order. One late afternoon, as golden light spilled through the Mitchells' living room, the phone shattered the quiet. Alana and Amara sat with Nina, poring over legal papers. When Clarice answered, her face drained of color as she listened, her free hand gripping the armrest. After a long, taut minute, she hung up and turned to them, her eyes wide with shock. "That was the assistant U.S. attorney," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've found something big on Walters and Kilroy, deep ties, deliberate targeting. They want you to in Jackson tomorrow for more statements." Nina's eyebrows shot up, a cautious smile tugging at her lips. "This could be it," she said. "The break we've been praying for." The next morning, the twins and Nina drove through the flat, sun-scorched expanse to a squat federal building in Jackson. Agent Ruiz, a weary woman with a no-nonsense air, and Daniel Berger, a lanky prosecutor with tired eyes, greeted them at the door. They ushered the group into a stark conference room, where a long table groaned under stacks of evidencephalos, transcripts, blurry surveillance stills. The air buzzed with gravity as Berger tapped a thick file. "We've traced a pattern," he said, his voice low and deliberate. 90% of Walters and Kilroy's big busts targeted people of color. "We've cross-checked with forensics, ballistics, financial stuff. The evidence is shaky. The other half's outright fake." Alana's heart pounded, a mix of rage and disbelief surging through her. "They were so bold," she said, her voice shaking. "How did they think they'd keep this buried?" Ruiz's lips pressed into a thin line, frustration etching her features. "Small towns breed loyalty among the powerful. They protect their own. Anyone who spoke up got scared of Funtley too, and others broke through." She slid a stack of photos across the table. Walters and Kilroy grinning beside seized cars, holding confiscated cash like trophies, their text messages a gallery of racist jabs and gloating. Alana's stomach twisted, bile rising as she absorbed the casual cruelty. "What's next?" she asked, forcing the words out. Berger glanced at Ruiz, a silent agreement passing between them. "We've got enough for federal civil rights charges," he said, "but we're digging deeper. There could be higher-ups in on this. We want the whole machine torn apart." Nina rested a steady hand on Amara's shoulder, her touch grounding. "That'll bolster your defense too," she added. "Prove the evidence against you was planted, and their case collapses." Ruiz nodded sharply. "If we link it to your arrest night, it's over for them." As they left the building, hope tangled with dread in the sisters' chests. The deeper the DOJ dug, the more lives they unearthed, shattered by years of Walters and Kilroy's unchecked power. The courtroom laughter that once stung their ears might soon boomerang back on the culprits, amplified by justice's heavy hand. Yet the path ahead was treacherous. Every revelation painted a bigger target on their backs, inviting retaliation from those desperate to bury the truth. Still, as they stepped into the blinding daylight, Amara and Alana felt a spark reignite, a purpose forged in the crucible of their fight. Justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a reckoning, a lesson carved in the ruins of abused power. And they would see it through, no matter the cost, even though fear still clung to them like a stubborn shadow. Alana and Amara began to see a faint glimmer of hope piercing through the gloom. They realized that truth, sharp and unyielding, was the most powerful weapon against the rod of corruption, of force that grew fiercer with every piece of the puzzle that clicked into place, every hidden deed dragged into the light. Amid the chaos of cascading revelations, the twin sisters fought to hold onto some shred of normalcy. They logged into their online classes, their fingers tapping nervously on keyboards as they tried to focus. They helped their parents with chores around the house, sweeping floors and washing dishes with a quiet determination. And they poured their hearts into volunteering at the youth center, where the laughter of kids offered a fleeting escape. Yet their lives had been thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. The outside world pressed in, relentless reporters occasionally rapped on their door, their voices eager and probing, hungry for a scoop that might turn their private struggle into tomorrow's headline. Nah, their sharp-witted legal counsel had warned them to keep the media at arm's length. One misstep, one carelessly spoken word, and the story could twist into a weapon aimed back at them. But then, one humid evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cicadas buzzed in the Mississippi dusk, an unexpected figure appeared at the Mitchell family's doorstep. He was a man in his late 30s, his suit crumpled as though he'd slept in it, his dark hair tousled and streaked with strands of gray. Standing on the porch, he introduced himself with a slight, nervous smile. "Gerald McClengery. To most folks, I'm a reporter with the Clarion Ledger, out of Jackson." His voice carried the weight of exhaustion, but also a spark of urgency. The sisters stood behind their parents, peering at him warily, while Clarice and Robert Mitchell listened with guarded expressions. Jerry shifted his weight, hands stuffed in his pockets as he launched into his pitch. "I've been chasing a story on police corruption in Hawthorne City for months now, digging through court transcripts, depositions, internal memos, you name it. What I've found, it's ugly. Walters and Kilroy, they're at the heart of it. And I think what you've been through could be the key to cracking this thing wide open. I'm not here to push, but I could use your help." Alana's stomach churned with a mix of curiosity and dread, her eyes flickering to Amara, who mirrored her uncertainty. Before either could muster a response, Clarice stepped forward, her tone polite but edged with steel. "We've got a lawyer handling this. We're not in a position to just chat about it out here on the porch." Jerry nodded, unfazed, as if he'd expected the rebuff. He fished a business card from his pocket, the edges slightly bent, and held it out. "I understand. No pressure, just give this to your counsel. If there's anything you can share on the record or off you think it could matter, really matter." Clarice took the card with a cautious hand, glancing at the text, "Gerald McClengery, investigative journalist," followed by a phone number and email. As Jerry turned to leave, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path, the family retreated to the living room, the air thick with unease. "Nah." When they briefed her later, urged restraint. "Journalists can be a mixed bag," she'd said over the phone, her voice steady but firm. "Some chase truth, some chase headlines. One wrong soundbite, and we're tangled in a legal mess, still." Jerry's mention of internal memos gnawed at her. Could they align with the Department of Justice's findings and bolster their case? Days slipped by, heavy with tension, until another knock rattled the door. This time, it was a familiar face that stirred a flood of memories. Carmen Reed, a childhood friend who'd once been as close as a sister to Alana and Amara. Before drifting away after high school, she stepped into the living room, her shoulders hunched, her eyes darting nervously as though she feared the walls might overhear. "I came as soon as I heard what's happening," she said, her voice trembling. "I've got something to tell you." The sisters sat across from her, leaning in as Carmen unraveled a story that hit like a punch to the gut. Years ago, her cousin Marcus had crossed paths with Walters and Kilroy. The cops had hauled him in on a flimsy drug possession charge, swearing they'd found the evidence in his pockets. Marcus had insisted it was a lie, that they'd planted it, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. A short stint in jail followed, enough to derail his college dreams and leave a scar on his future. Carmen's hands twisted in her lap as she spoke, tears glistening in her eyes. He kept telling us he was innocent. We didn't believe him, not fully. We were too scared to push back, terrified they'd come after us next. But seeing you two fight, I know he was telling the truth. Alana felt her chest tighten, a pang of empathy mingling with outrage. She could still taste the bitterness of her own arrest, cold metal of handcuffs, the smug grins of the officers who'd upended her life. Would Marcus talk to the DOJ? She asked, her voice soft but laced with hope. Carmen hesitated, chewing her lip. He's angry, bitter, even. It broke him in ways he doesn't like to admit. But if he knew there were others, that he wasn't alone, maybe. Nah. Joining the conversation by phone, jumped in with a rare burst of optimism. Get him to come forward. The more voices we have, the harder it is for Walters and Kilroy or anyone else in that departmental wriggle-free. This isn't just about you two anymore. Carmen's story was a thread in a larger tapestry, one woven from the pain of countless others who'd suffered under the same corrupt hands. The past was clawing its way into the present, demanding to be heard. In the weeks that followed, the fight gained momentum. Na filed motions in the local court to dismiss the charges against Alana and Amara, her arguments fortified by fresh evidence from the DOJ documents that painted Walters and Kilroy as predators in uniform. The hearing date loomed like a storm cloud, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Supporters rallied online, their hashtags lighting up social media. Justice for Themyslists, End Corruption. Friends and neighbors who'd known the twins since they were kids vouched for their character, insisting they'd never touch drugs. But a stubborn knot of detractorsome with ties to the police fought back, branding the sisters as agitators. Anonymous trolls flooded comment sections with venom, accusing them of playing the race card to dodge accountability. Walters and Kilroy, meanwhile, clung to their innocence, their faces plastered on a local news segment where they dismissed the allegations. As fake news cooked up by cop haters, their defiance only stoked the fire. Then came the turning point, a day that shattered the status quo in a flurry of coordinated raids. DOJ agents swept through Hawthorne City like a tidal wave. Witnesses gaped as federal officers stormed the police station, their boots echoing on the tiled floors, their hands clutching warrants. Filing cabinets were pried open, hard drives yanked from computers, every scrap of evidence seized in a meticulous sweep. By nightfall, the bombshell dropped. Walters and Kilroy were in custody, indicted on federal charges: conspiracy, civil rights violations, evidence tampering. News footage captured the surreal scene. The two officers, once so kosher, now handcuffed and hollow-eyed, flanked by agents as they were marched away. For the Mitchells, watching from their living room, it was a victory laced with gravity. Alana and Amara had ignited a chain reaction, toppling dominoes they hadn't even known existed. Yet the battle wasn't over. The local prosecutor, stubborn as ever, refused to drop the charges, leaving their fate in the hands of a judge. Late one night, as the family huddled around the TV replaying the day's chaos, Clarice turned to her daughters, her eyes shimmering with pride and exhaustion. One day, you'll look back on this and see how fierce you were, how you stood up to a machine that's been grinding people down for generations. Alana and Amara shared a quiet smile, their minds drifting to the courtroom where Walters and Kilroy had once sneered, to the sleepless nights in jail, to the hostile stares that had followed them home. Justice was inching closer, not just for them, but for Marcus, for Carmen's family, for a community that had lived too long under the weight of unchecked power. The morning of the hearing dawned with a crack of thunder, the sky over Hawthorne City Courthouse churning with dark clouds. Outside, a crowd swelled, supporters clutching signs that screamed justice for the Mitchell sisters and stop racial profiling, their voices rising in a defiant chorus. A scattering of counter-protesters lingered nearby, their glares sharp but outnumbered. Reporters jostled for position on the steps, cameras flashing like lightning. Inside, the courtroom hummed with restless energy, the wooden benches creaking under the weight of onlookers. Na stood at the defense table, her binder of evidence a fortress of facts, while Alana and Amara took their places beside her, their heads high despite the staresome warm. Some ice that bore into them. Judge Cohen ascended the bench, his face etched with fatigue, as if the weight of the case had already worn him thin. He banged the gavel, silencing the room. The prosecutor rose, his confidence visibly frayed, and began reciting the original charges: possession with intent to distribute. His words faltered, lacking the bravado of earlier days. Before he could build his case, Na cut in, her voice calm but commanding as she presented her motion to dismiss. She laid out the evidence, like a map to the truth: DOJ findings, witness testimonies of police misconduct, the federal indictments that had stripped Walters and Kilroy of their badges. The courtroom held its breath, the stakes palpable. For Alana and Amara, this wasn't just about clearing their names, it was about exposing a system that thrived on fear and abuse, about proving that power unchecked breeds ruin. Whatever the judge's ruling, they'd already lit a spark, and the flames of consequence were spreading. In the dimly lit courtroom, the prosecutor stumbled over his words, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. As he clung desperately to the fragile threads of his argument, he insisted with a wavering voice that the local case against the Mitchell sisters held merit. Yet the weight of the federal findings crashed down around him like an unrelenting avalanche, threatening to bury his claims. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through his notes, the confidence he'd once wielded like a weapon now slipping through his fingers. He couldn't shake the gnawing realization that the evidence piling up against him painted a far uglier picture than he'd anticipated, a portrait of corruption so deep it stained the very foundation of the justice system he'd sworn to uphold. Judge Cohen, perched on his elevated bench, leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly together as if anchoring himself against the storm brewing in his courtroom. His piercing gaze cut through the tension, and when he spoke, his voice carried the stern, unyielding timbre of a man who'd seen too much to tolerate half-truths. "I've gone through the Department of Justice documents line by line," he declared, his tone sharp enough to slice through the prosecutor's flimsy defenses. "What they reveal is nothing short of a disgrace, a systemic rot that demands answers. If the prosecution has any hope of keeping these charges alive, I need to hear an argument so compelling it can stand against this tidal wave of misconduct. Proceed." The prosecutor, visibly rattled, tugged at his tie as though it were choking him. His mind raced, grasping for a lifeline. "The DOJ's investigation is still unfolding," he stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. "These local charges can stand on their own merits, independent of federal oversight." But his words sounded hollow, even to his own ears, as the gallery shifted restlessly behind him. Across the room, Nina Barnes stood like a pillar of resolve, her dark eyes unflinching as she produced a single sheet of paper that would unravel his case entirely. It was a statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office, its words cold and precise, naming Alana and Amara Mitchell as undeniable victims of fabricated evidence in a cruel game orchestrated by those meant to protect them. Without missing a beat, Nina slid a thick stack of subpoenaed text messages across the table, each one a dagger aimed at the heart of the prosecution's narrative. The exchanges between officers Walters and Kilroy were chilling in their casual brutality, exposing a plot so calculated it turned the stomach. As Nina's steady voice filled the courtroom, reading one message aloud, the air grew thick with outrage. "Walters, got to girls, real pretty, real smug. They'll fold easy if we find the right evidence. Kilroy, yeah, let's teach them a lesson, just a little powder for them to cry about." The words hung there, venomous and unapologetic, as murmurs rippled through the spectators like a gathering storm. Even Judge Cohen, whose face rarely betrayed emotion, faltered for a moment, his jaw tightening as the mask of impartiality cracked under the weight of disgust. For Alana, seated beside her twin sister Amara, the moment was a collision of fury and fragile hope. Her heart thudded against her ribcage, each beat echoing the bitter sting of those callous words. She could picture Walter's smirk, Kilroy's snick-earth way they'd laughed as they schemed to ruin her life and her sister's, all to flex their petty power. Her stomach churned with rage, a fire that threatened to consume her. Yet beneath it flickered a spark of relief. Finally, the world would see these men for what they were, not guardians of justice, but predators cloaked in badges. Amara's hand found hers under the table, their fingers interlocking as if to tether each other against the flood of emotions, threatening to sweep them away. Judge Cohen removed his glasses slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose as though the act might erase the stain of what he'd just heard. When he spoke again, his voice was low but resolute, carrying the gravity of a man who'd reached the end of his patience. "This is deeply troubling," he said, his eyes sweeping the room before settling on the prosecutor, who seemed to shrink under the scrutiny. "The evidence of gross misconduct by the arresting officers is overwhelming. Unless something extraordinary changes my mind, I am inclined to dismiss all charges against the defendants." A muffled cheer broke out from the gallery, where supporters clutched each other in disbelief and triumph. Alana squeezed Amara's hand tighter, tears brimming in her eyes-net of sorrow, but of raw, unshakable vindication. Nina rested a steadying hand on Alana's shoulder, her quiet strength a reminder that they weren't alone in this fight. But Judge Cohen wasn't done. His gaze sharpened as it fixed on the prosecutor, who now looked like a man staring down the barrel of his own reckoning. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice rising with authority, "I am ordering an immediate and thorough review of every case these officers have ever touched. This cannot stand. The case against Alana and Amara Mitchell is hereby dismissed. They walk out of this courtroom free, and I sincerely hope the justice system takes every step to right the wrongs inflicted upon them." With a resounding crack, his gavel struck the bench, a sound that reverberated through the room like a thunderclap. The gallery erupted in applause, a wave of sound that washed over the sisters, draining the tension from their bodies. For the first time in weeks, they exhaled together, the suffocating weight of fear and uncertainty lifting from their shoulders. The courtroom laughter that had once mocked them now morphed into a powerful echo of their resilience, a testament to the unshakable force of truth. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as a swarm of journalists descended, their cameras flashing like lightning and microphones thrusting forward like spears. Nina, ever the protector, guided the sisters through the chaos to a small podium hastily erected by a local activist group. Alana's pulse still raced, her chest tight with the enormity of the moment, but she steadied herself against the podium, her knuckles whitening as she gripped its edges. "Today's dismissal is a relief," she began, her voice trembling slightly before growing stronger with each word. "But this isn't just about us celebrating our freedom. We're here to shine a light on everyone who's been crushed by a system that let to corrupt officers plant evidence and shatter lives. This isn't the end, it's the start of a bigger battle for accountability." Amara stepped up beside her, her presence a quiet fire that complemented Alana's intensity. "We're so grateful to everyone who believed in us," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "To those who spoke out, who dug for the truth when it was buried under leash, we stand with you. We stand with everyone still fighting to prove their innocence. We won't stop until justice reaches every last person who's been wronged." The crowd roared, a swell of cheers mingling with the relentless click of camera shutters, the sunlight overhead blazing like a beacon of renewal. For the first time in weeks, the sisters could breathe deeply, the air untainted by the shadow of false accusations. Yet the day's drama wasn't over. As they descended the courthouse steps, surrounded by family, friends, and a sea of supporters, Alana's eyes caught a glimpse of movement that stopped her cold. There, flanked by federal marshals, were Walters and Kilroy, their once swaggering figures now reduced to hunched silhouettes in orange jumpsuits. The cocky grins they'd worn like armor were gone, replaced by hollow stares and taut lips that betrayed their fear. Gone was the arrogance that had fueled their laughter, supplanted by the stark reality that their sins had been dragged into the light. For a fleeting second, Alana's gaze locked with Kilroy's. She searched his face for remorse, but found only cowardice. Looked away, unable to bear the weight of her stare. In that moment, she felt no pity, only the cold, unyielding satisfaction of justice served, a karmic balance restored. The gavel had fallen, and the days of tormenting the innocent had crumbled to dust. In the weeks that followed, Alana and Amara found themselves swept into a whirlwind of attention. Invitations poured in from churches eager for them to speak on social justice, from universities hoping to inspire students with their story, and from media outlets clamoring for exclusive tell-alls. At first, the intensity overwhelmed them, their quiet lives suddenly thrust into a spotlight they hadn't sought. But as the letters and calls piled up, they began to see the ripples their victory had created, touching a raw nerve in the national conversation about policing, power, and prejudice. They felt a duty to wield this platform with care, to amplify the voiceless, even as they longed to reclaim the simple pleasures stolen from thematic classes, without the threat of bail, volunteering at the youth center without dread creeping up their spines. Their parents, too, felt the shift. Clarice Mitchell no longer jolted awake in the dead of night, her cheeks streaked with silent tears, haunted by visions of her daughters in chains. Leonard could now sit at the kitchen table, his deep voice rumbling with plans for the future, watching the twins graduate, taking that long-delayed family trip to the coast. Meanwhile, the federal probe into Hawthorne City PD burrowed deeper, unearthing a sprawling network of corruption that ensnared not just Walters and Kilroy, but a handful of their colleagues and whispers of higher-ups who'd turned a blind eye. Rumors swirled of a new leadership taking root, monitored by federal overseers to enforce real change. Some in the community scoffed, doubting the system could truly heal, but others clung to a fragile hope that this was the dawn of something better. One crisp autumn afternoon, Agent Carla Ruiz returned to the Mitchell home, her usual stern demeanor softened by a rare smile. The civil rights trial against Walters and Kilroy is set for early next year, she announced, settling into a chair across from the sisters. Your testimony, your evidence cites the backbone of this case. They'll call on you to tell your story again. Alana met her gaze, her chin lifting with a confidence forged through fire. We'll be there, she said firmly, her mind drifting back to that night of flashing lights and handcuffs, a nightmare that now fueled her resolve. Amara nodded beside her, her quiet strength a mirror to her sister's defiance. No threat could muzzle them now. With their criminal ordeal behind them, Nina Barnes sat them down one evening, her sharp eyes glinting with purpose. You should sue the city, she urged, laying out the case with the precision of a seasoned advocate. Damages, emotional distress, legal fees, the hit to your reputations. It's not about money. It's about forcing accountability. If they feel it in their budget, they might actually rethink how they operate. After nights of hushed family talks, weighing the cost of more public scrutiny against the principle at stake, the sisters agreed. The civil suit exploded into the headlines, thrusting them deeper into the fray. But they stood tall, knowing each step chipped away at the edifice of unchecked power. On a chilly November evening, the Mitchells hosted a modest backyard gatheringa celebration of freedom, stitched together with potluck dishes and heartfelt embraces. Close friends mingled with neighbors, and new allies emerged from the shadows of their struggle. Carmen Reed arrived with her son Marcus, a weary young man whose own wrongful arrest had left scars he'd buried deep. After months of silence, he'd finally spoken to the DOJ, inspired by the twins' courage. You gave me the push I needed, he said, his voice breaking as tears welled in his eyes, recounting the jobs he'd lost, the dreams deferred. Amara reached out, her touch gentle. That's all we wanted, she murmured, for people to stand up together, to stop letting the system grind them down. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived from Jerry McClenn, a reporter at the Clarion Ledger who'd taken up their cause. Inside were internal police memos and emails, a paper trail of corruption that made Alana's blood run cold. One message detailed how Walters and Kilroy had been shielded by superiors who dismissed red flags, while another outlined a chilling plan to target problematic voices in the community. Reading it, Alana's hands shook not with fear, but with the stark realization of how close they'd come to being erased. Just another name lost to a rigged game. Their story was no longer just theirs, it was gaining traction across the country, drawing the eye of a prominent civil rights activist from Jackson who arrived with an offer to lift their voices onto a national stage. Through it all, the sisters carried a hard-earned lesson. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed by the powerful, it was a fire stoked by the relentless, a flame that burned brightest when the abused refused to bow. Walters and Kilroy had wielded their authority like a club, but the consequences of their hubris now shackled them. a reminder that power unchecked was a house of cards waiting to fall. For Alana and Amara, every step forward was a vow to themselves, to their community, to the countless others still clawing for light that the laughter of corrupt men would never again drown out the roar of truth. The auditorium hummed with the restless energy of hundreds of eager listeners, their murmurs weaving a tapestry of anticipation as Alana and Amara stepped onto the stage. The twin sisters, their faces alight with a quiet determination, began to unravel the threads of their extraordinary journey. It started innocently in volunteering at a youth center in Hawthorne City, where they'd spent countless hours mentoring kids with dreams bigger than their circumstances. Their voices trembled slightly as they recalled the abrupt shift, the night they were yanked from that world of hope into a nightmare of humiliation. Stripped of their dignity in a frigid holding cell, they'd shivered under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, their hearts pounding with a cocktail of fear, anger, and disbelief. Yet here they stood now, victorious, in a courtroom that had once echoed with the jeers of those who'd branded them criminals. The memory of that scorn still stung, but it was drowned out by the triumph of their vindication. Amara's voice, steady and resonant, cut through the room as she gripped the microphone. If to college students from a place like Hawthorne City can rise up and ignite a flicker of change, she said, her eyes sweeping the crowd, just imagine what a whole community, even a nation, could accomplish together. Her words landed like a spark on dry timber, and the audience erupted into applause that rolled like thunder. Flashbulbs popped, freezing their earnest expressions in bursts of light, while social media erupted with admiration for their grit and grace. Offers flooded in partnerships with non-profits eager to harness their story, scholarships to fuel their futures, even whispers of a book deal that could etch their saga into permanence. But beneath the clamor, Alana and Amara remained anchored to a singular truth. They craved justice, not the spotlight. Fame was a fleeting shadow. What mattered was lifting up others still crushed beneath the weight of false blame. Every ounce of support they gained, they swore, would flow into that mission. Weeks stretched into months, and the gnawing anxiety that once shadowed their every step began to morph into something fierce a purpose. Their civil case churned forward, a slow but relentless machine. Settlement talks bubbled up, tentative at first, then urgent, as the city's attorneys scrambled to dodge the glare of a public trial. They could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken dread of officials who knew the sisters' story could unravel far more than a single case. Meanwhile, the architects of their misery, officers Walters and Kilroy, languished in federal custody. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Once, they'd strutted with the arrogance of untouchable power, their badges gleaming like shields against accountability. Now, they sat behind bars, awaiting a reckoning that mirrored the one they'd forced upon the twins. The reversal was poetic, a bitter twist that underscored a timeless lesson. Unchecked power breeds its own downfall. Then came the bombshell that shook the city to its core. Walters, it turned out, had a secret, a child born out of state, a life he'd buried under layers of deceit. He'd siphoned illicit cash from seized property, funneled it to the mother as hush money, all while wearing the mask of authority. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, shattering any lingering sympathy for him. Kilroy's disgrace was no less damning. A sprawling paper trail, unread mails, text messages, a venomous litany of racial slurs that painted an indelible portrait of his hatred. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his defense, proof that his policing wasn't just reckless, but rooted in malice. With every uncovered truth, the public's outrage swelled, their patience fraying to a thread. Alana and Amara's ordeal, once dismissed as an isolated tragedy, now loomed as the jagged edge of a far uglier reality, an entire system that had let men like Walters and Kilroy thrive unchecked. The city trembled under the weight of that realization, its leaders promising reforms as sweeping as the winter winds that now swept through Hawthorne's streets. On a crisp evening, the sisters stood on their porch, cradling mugs of hot cocoa that steamed in the chilly air. Their breath curled into fleeting clouds as they gazed out at the neighborhood that had borne witness to their fight. Silently, they traced the arc of their journey from the moment they'd been cornered, handcuffs biting into their wrists, to the day the charges dissolved like mist under the sun. Gratitude surged within them, warm and overwhelming, for the community that had rallied, for the federal support that had tipped the scales toward truth. The mocking laughter that once haunted that dingy courtroom had faded, replaced by a rising chorus of voice resolute, unbroken manding change that wouldn't bend or break. Hawthorne City stood on the cusp of a new dawn, one the twins had helped forge. And though the scars of their ordeal lingered, those marks were no longer just wounds. They were badges of their resilience, testaments to the strength found in standing firm, to the power of truth when it refuses to be silenced. The supporting cast of their story grew richer with each passing day. There was Marla, the youth center director who'd first encouraged their volunteering, her eyes brimming with pride as she watched them speak. She'd spent sleepless nights after their arrest, racked with guilt for not shielding them. Yet her quiet resolve had fueled their early defiance. Then there was Jamal, a classmate who'd organized the first protest outside the precinct, his voice hoarse from chanting their names into the night. His anger had been a fire, but his loyalty a steady anchor. Even the city attorneys, cloaked in their polished suits, revealed flickers of nervous glances exchanged during settlement talks, hints of regret for defending a rotting system. These figures, once peripheral, now stood as pillars in a saga that transcended the twins alone. Every small moment swelled with new weight. The clink of handcuffs that night, sharp and cold against Alana's skin, replayed in her mind like a drumbeat of defiance. The way Amara's hands shook as she signed the legal papers, her signature a trembling vow to fight on. The first letter of support from a stranger, its ink smudged with tears, that arrived just when despair threatened to swallow them whole. These fragments wove into a tapestry of struggle and triumph, a reminder that justice isn't a gift bestowed, it's a flame tended by those brave enough to hold it aloft. Alana and Amara's story pulsed with a raw, unyielding truth. Corruption may cast a long shadow, but courage, unity, and the relentless pursuit of what's right can pierce even the darkest veil. Their scars whispered of pain endured, but their voices roared of a future reclaimed, a legacy not just for them, but for every soul still waiting for the scales to tip toward justice.